The smallest thing a person throws away can become the one thing they desperately need. And before this morning ended, an entire airport would discover that truth the hard way. The winter sunrise painted the snow-covered peaks surrounding Aspen, Colorado in shades of gold, while a crisp mountain breeze carried the scent of pine, jet fuel, and fresh coffee through the private terminal. A gleaming $90 million business jet rested outside an immaculate hangar, its polished fuselage reflecting the first light of the day like a mirror. Ground crews hurried across the ramp. Luxury vehicles lined the entrance, and assistants moved with practiced urgency, because every minute mattered when the owner of one of the nation's fastest-growing investment companies was preparing to leave. Mason Reed tightened the final latch on a compact handheld safety device before slipping it carefully into a protective pouch. At 35, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who never needed to announce what he knew. His dark brown hair was neatly combed despite the cold wind. His angular face showed years of honest work rather than comfort, and his sturdy frame disappeared beneath a worn mechanic's jacket marked with faded patches from countless mornings inside the hangar. Across the service bay, his 9-year-old daughter, Emma, sat bundled in a warm blue coat while finishing her spelling homework beside a small space heater, occasionally smiling toward her father with complete trust. Mason looked once more at the diagnostic readings from the jet before walking toward the private terminal entrance. Harper Winslow stepped through the glass doors surrounded by executives, legal advisors, and personal assistants, her elegant white business suit standing out against the snowy landscape. At 29, she projected calm authority with every step, her blonde hair catching the morning sunlight, while every employee nearby instinctively moved aside to clear her path. A billion-dollar acquisition meeting awaited her in New York before noon, and the schedule allowed no delays. Mason approached respectfully. "Ms. Winslow," he said evenly, "I would appreciate 60 seconds of your time." One assistant immediately stepped forward. "She has a full schedule." Mason nodded politely. "I understand. This concerns your aircraft." Harper paused just long enough to glance at him. Mason carefully held out the small handheld device. "I modified this verification tool after reviewing a minor inconsistency in your aircraft's safety data. It should be connected before departure. If everything checks out, you lose 1 minute. If it does not, it may save much more than that." Harper studied the plain gray device for only a moment before looking back at her watch. "My airplane is maintained by one of the best aviation teams in the country," she replied calmly. "I do not think I need another gadget." Before Mason could answer, one of the executives laughed quietly. "Everyone wants to be the hero." Another employee shook his head, probably hoping for a reward. Harper sighed softly, accepted the device with 2 fingers, then turned toward the nearest trash container beside the terminal entrance. Without anger or cruelty, only complete confidence in her own judgment, she dropped it into the bin and continued walking toward the waiting jet. A few people smiled awkwardly. Others laughed under their breath. Emma watched everything from across the ramp, her small face filled with confusion. She looked at her father. "Dad, are you going to tell her?" Mason simply smiled, his voice as steady as the mountains surrounding them. Sometimes people only understand the value of protection after they discover what it was protecting them from. He picked up his toolbox without another word and quietly returned to the hangar, unaware that within the next hour the same aircraft everyone believed was ready to conquer the skies would refuse to leave the runway for a reason only one forgotten single father already understood. Edit. The laughter near the terminal slowly faded into the distance as Mason Reed walked back across the frozen ramp with his old metal toolbox in one hand and quiet peace in his heart. Snow crunched beneath his work boots while the morning sun climbed higher above the mountains surrounding Aspen. He had long ago discovered that the opinions of strangers lasted only a moment, but character stayed with a person for a lifetime. Emma hurried beside him, her backpack bouncing gently against her shoulders. She looked up with the honest curiosity only a child could carry. "Dad, why did everyone laugh?" Mason opened the hangar door before answering. Sometimes people believe expensive things cannot fail, and they believe simple people cannot be right. Emma frowned slightly. "Were you upset when she threw away your device?" Mason placed his toolbox carefully onto the workbench before smiling at his daughter. "No, sweetheart. Anger never fixes anything. We only control whether we keep doing the right thing. Emma accepted the answer with a thoughtful nod before returning to her spelling workbook beside the portable heater. The small hangar looked nothing like the luxurious terminal across the runway. The concrete floor carried years of honest work. Shelves held neatly labeled tools, and a faded coffee maker quietly filled the room with its familiar aroma. Every wrench rested exactly where Mason expected it because discipline had become a habit rather than a rule. A framed photograph sat quietly above his workbench, showing a younger Mason standing beside a prototype aircraft with a group of engineers. He rarely looked at it anymore. That chapter of his life belonged to another time. His life now revolved around Emma, honest work, and making certain every airplane leaving Aspen carried families safely home. Across the airport, Harper Winslow climbed the polished stairs into her private jet while assistants settled into leather seats and reviewed schedules. One advisor looked at the morning itinerary. "We will land in New York with 35 minutes to spare before the acquisition meeting." Harper nodded confidently. "Good. Let us keep it that way." Outside, Captain Ryan Dalton and his first officer completed their standard pre-flight inspection with practiced efficiency. Fuel quantities matched the flight plan. Flight controls moved normally. Weather conditions remained favorable despite light mountain winds. Everything appeared exactly as expected for a routine departure. Ground personnel disconnected external power, removed wheel chocks, and signaled for engine start clearance. The left engine came alive smoothly, followed seconds later by the right. Deep inside the cockpit, however, a small amber status message appeared briefly across the lower system's display before disappearing almost as quickly as it had arrived. The first officer noticed it immediately. "Did you catch that?" Captain Dalton nodded. "Probably a temporary synchronization check." Both men continued monitoring the displays. Every indication quickly returned to green. Meanwhile, inside the hangar, Mason reviewed maintenance notes from another aircraft when his phone vibrated quietly across the workbench. The caller identification showed the airport operations office. He answered calmly. "This is Mason Reed." A nervous voice replied. "Mr. Reed, I know this may sound unusual, but could you come back to the executive ramp?" Mason remained silent for a moment. "What happened?" The dispatcher hesitated before answering. The Winslow jet completed every normal startup procedure, but the flight management system just rejected takeoff authorization, and nobody can explain why. Mason slowly looked toward the empty pouch that had once held the safety device, now resting somewhere inside a trash container outside the terminal. He closed his eyes for only a second before picking up his jacket. "I will be there in 2 minutes." The executive ramp had transformed from a place of confidence into one of quiet confusion by the time Mason Reed arrived. Ground crews stood in small circles studying maintenance tablets while engineers moved between the aircraft and the operations vehicle carrying diagnostic equipment worth more than Mason's entire workshop. The $90 million jet remained motionless on the ramp, both engines idling smoothly, yet refusing to advance beyond the final departure sequence. Captain Ryan Dalton stepped down from the aircraft with a thoughtful expression instead of frustration. He had flown enough years to understand that modern aircraft almost never stopped without a reason. Harper Winslow stood several yards away speaking with her chief operations officer, her calm voice revealing only the slightest hint of concern. "How long?" she asked. The senior maintenance supervisor answered carefully. "We have already completed the standard restart procedure twice. Every primary system appears healthy, but the flight management computer continues rejecting takeoff authorization because it cannot verify a protected safety sequence." Harper folded her arms. "Replace the computer." The supervisor shook his head. "It is not the computer. Replace the sensor. We already tested it. Then replace whatever is causing this delay." The supervisor hesitated because there was nothing obvious left to replace. Another technician arrived carrying fresh diagnostic reports. "Hydraulic pressure is normal. Flight controls are normal. Ice protection is normal. Electrical distribution is normal." Captain Dalton quietly added, "Yet the aircraft still believes one verification step has not been completed." Silence settled across the group. Harper glanced toward the runway where another business jet lifted gracefully into the clear Colorado sky. Every passing minute carried her farther from the meeting waiting in New York, but for the first time that morning, she realized determination alone could not persuade an airplane to fly. At the edge of the gathering, One young technician noticed Mason approaching with his old toolbox. Before anyone else spoke, the airport manager stepped directly into his path. "We have certified engineers working this problem," he said politely but firmly. "There is nothing else you need to do." Mason remained completely calm. "I did not come to interrupt anyone. Your dispatcher asked me to help." The manager sighed. "Because people are running out of ideas." Mason nodded gently. Sometimes that is when the smallest detail becomes the most important. Harper recognized him immediately. For only a brief moment, she looked toward the nearby trash container where she remembered dropping the small gray device earlier that morning. She quickly pushed the thought aside. "Mr. Reed," she said professionally, "my team appreciates your concern, but this aircraft is maintained by factory-certified specialists." Mason answered with the same quiet respect he had shown hours earlier. "I have no doubt they are excellent." "Then what makes you believe you can solve something they cannot?" one executive asked with a faint smile. Mason looked toward the aircraft instead of the people questioning him. "Because I am not trying to solve what the computer is saying. I am trying to understand what it is protecting." Captain Dalton studied Mason carefully. The mechanic did not sound like someone searching for recognition. He sounded like someone listening to the airplane itself. The captain turned toward the maintenance supervisor. "Humor me," he said quietly. "Let us hear him out." Before Mason answered, his eyes drifted once more toward the trash container beside the terminal entrance, and with a calm voice that immediately captured everyone's attention, he asked a single question. "Has anyone looked inside that trash bin today?" For several long seconds, nobody moved. The question sounded almost absurd, surrounded by experienced engineers, advanced diagnostic computers, and one of the most sophisticated business jets ever built. The airport manager frowned. "The trash bin." Mason Reed nodded calmly. "Yes." One technician exchanged puzzled glances with another before walking toward the metal container beside the terminal entrance. He lifted the lid, carefully searched beneath coffee cups, paper towels, and discarded packaging, then finally held up the small gray safety device that had been thrown away earlier that morning. A thin layer of dust covered its surface, but it appeared otherwise untouched. The technician carried it back across the ramp while everyone watched in silence. Harper Winslow recognized it immediately. For the first time since arriving at the airport, genuine regret appeared in her expression. She accepted the device without speaking, then quietly handed it to Mason. "I should not have dismissed you," she admitted softly. Mason accepted the device with both hands as though it were nothing more than another ordinary tool. "What matters now is helping everyone get where they need to go safely." Captain Ryan Dalton stepped closer. "Can you explain what it actually does?" Mason gently removed the protective cover and connected the device to an auxiliary diagnostic port beneath the aircraft's forward service panel. A small display illuminated with rows of engineering data unavailable through the standard cockpit screens. Numbers scrolled quietly across the display while Mason watched without rushing. Around him, conversations faded. Even the maintenance supervisor stopped checking his tablet. After nearly a minute, Mason pointed toward one narrow column of information. "There it is." The supervisor leaned closer. "I do not recognize that parameter." "You would not," Mason replied. "Your system is confirming that every major component is healthy. This device verifies whether those healthy systems are communicating with one another correctly before takeoff." Harper looked toward the aircraft. "So nothing is broken?" Mason smiled gently. "Sometimes nothing is broken, yet everything is still unsafe because one small conversation inside the airplane never takes place." Captain Dalton nodded slowly as the explanation settled into place. Mason continued. "The aircraft detected an incomplete synchronization between the wing anti-ice verification sequence and the secondary departure safety logic. The flight management computer refused takeoff because it could not prove those systems had completed their final handshake." The maintenance supervisor stared at the display in disbelief. "Our standard diagnostics never checked that relationship. That is why they could not find the problem," Mason answered quietly. The airplane was protecting itself exactly as it was designed to do. Harper watched him with growing respect. The confidence she had mistaken for stubbornness now sounded like experience earned through years of patient work. Mason pressed several keys on the handheld device before initiating a manual verification sequence. Within moments, the diagnostic display completed its cycle and transmitted a confirmation directly into the aircraft's maintenance interface. Across the cockpit, a soft electronic tone sounded. Captain Dalton looked down at his primary display. Every amber advisory disappeared. One by one, every system indicator returned to steady green. The first officer smiled with quiet relief. Takeoff authorization restored. No one cheered. No one applauded. They simply stood together on the frozen ramp beneath the Colorado morning sky, realizing that the smallest object discarded only an hour earlier had revealed what millions of dollars in equipment could not. And the quiet single father everyone had overlooked had listened carefully enough to hear the truth hidden inside an airplane that had been speaking all along. The silence surrounding the aircraft lasted longer than anyone expected because no one knew how to respond when a simple answer arrived from the person they had dismissed first. Captain Ryan Dalton stepped down from the cockpit carrying the updated maintenance confirmation in his hand. He walked directly toward Mason Reed before extending his hand with genuine respect. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You trusted the airplane before you trusted assumptions." Mason returned the handshake with a gentle smile. The airplane was only asking for someone to listen. Nearby, the senior maintenance supervisor slowly reviewed the diagnostic report again and again. Every line confirmed exactly what Mason had explained. The specialized verification sequence had exposed a communication fault hidden between two healthy systems, something their standard equipment had never been designed to analyze. One of the younger engineers looked at the small handheld device with amazement. "Where did you even get something like this?" Mason glanced at the worn case resting beside his toolbox. "I built it over time. Every aircraft teaches you something if you pay attention long enough." Harper Winslow stood quietly only a few feet away, watching the conversation unfold. The confidence that had filled her voice earlier that morning had disappeared, replaced by thoughtful humility. She took one slow step toward Mason. "Mr. Reed," she said softly, "I owe you more than an apology." Mason looked at her with the same calm expression he had worn since sunrise. "Everyone makes decisions with the information they have." Harper lowered her eyes briefly. "No, I made a judgment about a person instead of listening to what he was trying to protect." She paused before continuing. "There is a difference." Around them, the airport staff who had laughed earlier no longer spoke. Several mechanics quietly returned to work without lifting their eyes. Even the airport manager removed his gloves and approached Mason with visible embarrassment. "I should have invited you into the conversation from the beginning," he admitted. Mason simply nodded. "We all want the same thing. Safe flights." Captain Dalton smiled. "And today you reminded all of us that safety begins with humility." Harper reached into her briefcase and removed an envelope. "This covers your invoice and the value of your time." Mason accepted it politely without checking what was inside. She then removed a second folder bearing the Winslow Meridian Group logo. "I would also like to invite you to meet with my executive leadership team. We need people who understand responsibility the way you do." Mason remained thoughtful for several moments before answering. He looked through the open hangar doors toward Emma, who had been quietly waiting beside the old pickup truck, reading her library book without complaining. "My first responsibility will always be my daughter," he said gently. "If I cannot be there when school ends, then I cannot accept." Harper followed his gaze toward Emma and smiled warmly. "Then perhaps we should rethink the position instead of asking you to rethink your priorities." Mason's eyes reflected quiet gratitude, not excitement. That would be a conversation worth having. Moments later, the engines of the restored business jet came alive once more, their steady sound echoing across the snowy mountains surrounding Aspen. This time, every system completed its verification exactly as designed. As the aircraft slowly taxied toward the runway, Harper looked back through the cabin window at the small hangar growing smaller behind her. She no longer saw an ordinary mechanic standing beside an old toolbox. She saw a devoted single father whose quiet dignity had accomplished what money, status, and advanced technology could not. And while the jet finally lifted gracefully into the bright Colorado sky, the greatest thing leaving the airport that morning was not an airplane at all. It was a lesson that true wisdom never demands attention, because it quietly earns respect one honest act at a time. 3 days later, fresh snow covered the rooftops of Aspen, while life inside Hangar 12 returned to the steady rhythm Mason Reed valued most. The old coffee maker hummed softly in the corner, the familiar scent of machine oil mixed with pine drifting through the open hangar doors, and Emma sat beside the workbench finishing a science project about mountain wildlife. To anyone passing by, nothing seemed different. Mason still greeted every customer with the same quiet smile. He still inspected every aircraft as though the people inside carried someone waiting for them at home. He never mentioned the business jet or the morning that had briefly placed him at the center of everyone's attention. Across the country, however, the story had quietly traveled farther than he expected. Inside the headquarters of Winslow Meridian Group in New York, Harper Winslow stood before her executive leadership team, holding the small gray safety device Mason had built. The room remained unusually quiet as she placed it gently on the conference table. "This," she began calmly, "is the reason our aircraft reached New York safely and why our company avoided making a very expensive mistake." Several executives exchanged curious glances. One senior vice president asked, "Who manufactured it?" Harper smiled faintly. "A single father working in a small maintenance hangar outside Aspen." Another executive looked surprised. "Our engineering suppliers have never mentioned him." Harper answered without hesitation. "That says more about us than it does about him." She described everything that had happened, including the moment she had thrown the device away without giving it a chance. No one interrupted. By the time she finished, every person around the table understood that the greatest failure had not been technical. It had been the failure to listen. Harper closed the meeting with a decision that surprised everyone. "Beginning today, every executive in this company will spend one full day each year working alongside our maintenance teams before approving any aviation safety budget." No one objected. Hundreds of miles away, Mason tightened the final inspection panel on a family-owned turboprop aircraft before handing the owner a completed maintenance report. "She is ready," he said warmly. The grateful pilot smiled. "My grandchildren are waiting in Denver. Thank you for taking such good care of her." Mason simply nodded. "Have a safe trip." As the airplane departed into the bright Colorado sky, Emma walked over carrying 2 sandwiches wrapped in paper. "Lunch break," she announced proudly. Mason laughed softly. "Best supervisor I have ever had." They sat together on the hangar steps overlooking the runway where snow sparkled beneath the afternoon sun. Emma looked toward the mountains before asking, "Dad, do you think that lady remembers what you told her?" Mason opened his sandwich and thought for a moment. "I hope she remembers something even more important." "What is that?" Emma asked. He smiled gently. "That every person she meets knows something she does not. When we remember that, we become better listeners." At that very moment, Harper's private jet crossed the Colorado sky on its return flight, and as she looked down through the cabin window toward the snow-covered valleys below, she quietly held the small gray device in her hands. She no longer saw an ordinary tool built by an ordinary mechanic. She saw a reminder that wisdom often arrived wearing worn work boots, that dignity never needed to announce itself, and that the strongest foundations for both great companies and meaningful lives were always built upon humility, respect, and the quiet courage to listen before judging another human being. One quiet week later, the morning air over Aspen carried the familiar scent of fresh snow and pine, while the small maintenance hangar welcomed another ordinary day that Mason Reed never considered ordinary at all. He believed every aircraft represented birthdays, family reunions, business dreams, and children waiting for someone to come home. That belief guided every inspection more faithfully than any checklist ever could. Emma carefully arranged fresh crayons beside her homework before waving cheerfully to the local pilots who now greeted her by name whenever they stopped by the hangar. Life had settled back into its comfortable rhythm until a line of black sport utility vehicles slowly entered the airport through the private security gate. Mechanics paused beside open engine panels. Fuel truck operators looked up from their work. Even the airport manager quietly removed his cap as the convoy came to a stop outside Hangar 12. Harper Winslow stepped out wearing an elegant white winter coat over a tailored white business suit, carrying no reporters, photographers, or publicity staff. She had come without announcements because she wanted gratitude to remain personal rather than performative. Mason looked up from the inspection panel of a small twin-engine aircraft and smiled politely. "Good morning, Ms. Winslow." Harper returned the smile with genuine warmth. "Good morning, Mr. Reed. I hope I am not interrupting your work." Mason gently secured the inspection panel before answering. Safe work can always pause for a conversation. Emma quietly closed her notebook and watched from nearby, sensing something important without fully understanding why. Harper reached into her leather portfolio and placed several documents on the workbench beside Mason's worn toolbox. Our board approved a new aviation safety initiative exactly as we discussed. We also established a scholarship for young engineers who choose safety before recognition. Mason glanced at the papers without reaching for them. That is generous. Harper shook her head softly. It is necessary. She paused before continuing. There is one more thing. She removed a framed photograph taken by an airport security camera on the morning the business jet had been delayed. The image showed Mason standing quietly beside the aircraft while everyone else argued around him. This hangs outside my executive office now, she said. Not because you repaired an airplane, but because you reminded me what leadership looks like. Mason studied the photograph for a long moment before smiling almost to himself. I was only doing my job. Captain Ryan Dalton, who had accompanied Harper, laughed gently. That is exactly why it belongs there. The surrounding mechanics listened without speaking. No one interrupted because every person present remembered how differently they had treated Mason only days earlier. The airport manager finally stepped forward. Mr. Reed, he said sincerely, I have worked here for 18 years, and I cannot remember a time when I learned a bigger lesson from a quieter man. Mason looked around the hangar, then toward Emma, who smiled proudly from her little folding chair. Children pay attention to what adults honor, he said softly. If Emma grows up believing kindness matters more than applause, then I have already received everything I hoped life would give me. Harper followed his gaze toward the little girl and felt a quiet emotion settle into her heart. For the first time in many years, she understood that the strongest people were not always the loudest, the richest, or the most celebrated. Sometimes they were simply the ones who chose to protect strangers, forgive mistakes, and walk back to work without asking the world to notice. As snowflakes drifted gently across the runway outside, no one hurried to leave the hangar, because some moments were too meaningful to rush, and the silence surrounding them spoke more clearly than any speech ever could. The visit from Harper Winslow quietly changed more than anyone inside Hangar 12 realized. During the following weeks, pilots from across Colorado began stopping by the small maintenance shop, not because they questioned their aircraft, but because they trusted the man inspecting them. Mason Reed accepted every handshake with the same humility he had shown before anyone knew his name. He never displayed the framed documents Harper had left behind. They remained neatly stored inside a drawer while his old toolbox continued to occupy the center of his workbench. Emma often smiled when customers thanked her father, but she noticed something else as well. They listened now. They no longer interrupted him. They no longer assumed that expensive equipment always knew more than experienced hands. One snowy afternoon, a luxury SUV quietly arrived outside the hangar. This time Harper came alone. She carried only a small paper bag from a local bakery and 2 cups of hot chocolate. Mason looked up from replacing a landing light on a family airplane and smiled. You did not have to bring anything. Harper laughed softly. I was told your daughter likes cinnamon rolls. Emma's eyes brightened immediately, and Mason thanked her with quiet gratitude. The 3 of them sat together on folding chairs near the open hangar door while snow drifted gently across the runway. There were no executives, no cameras, and no urgent schedules. For the first time, Harper experienced an afternoon without constant phone calls or board meetings. She watched Emma describe her favorite science project with endless enthusiasm while Mason listened with complete attention, never checking a watch or looking at a telephone. After several peaceful minutes, Harper asked a question that had stayed with her ever since the morning they first met. Why did you leave aerospace engineering? Mason remained silent for a moment before answering. Because one day I realized I was becoming very successful at work, while slowly becoming absent everywhere else that mattered. He looked toward Emma with a gentle smile. After my wife passed away, my daughter deserved more than a father whose voice only came through video calls. Harper lowered her eyes. Was it difficult walking away from everything you built? Mason nodded honestly. Very. But careers can often be rebuilt. Childhood cannot. The words settled quietly between them. Harper thought about the years she had spent racing from one meeting to another, measuring success by quarterly reports and market values, while friendships quietly faded into memories. I spent so much time protecting my company, she admitted softly. that I forgot companies exist to serve people, not the other way around. Mason smiled warmly. The beautiful thing about wisdom is that it always arrives in time for tomorrow. Emma reached into the paper bag and handed Harper the last cinnamon roll. Dad says sharing makes everything taste better. Harper accepted it with a grateful smile, realizing that the smallest lesson of the afternoon had come from the youngest person in the hangar. As the winter sun slowly settled behind the mountains, Captain Ryan Dalton unexpectedly walked through the hangar carrying a technical journal. He placed it gently on Mason's workbench and opened to a feature article highlighting the new aviation safety initiatives spreading through the industry. At the center of the first page appeared a photograph of the small gray handheld device beside a single sentence that read, "The future of aviation safety may begin by listening to the quiet experts we almost overlook." Captain Dalton looked at Mason and smiled. "Your invention is changing more than one airplane." Mason quietly closed the magazine without reading another word. He looked instead toward Emma, who was laughing with Harper beside the open hangar door, and in that simple moment he knew the greatest legacy he would ever leave behind would never be measured by inventions, recognition, or headlines, but by the lives made safer and the hearts reminded that genuine greatness always begins with humility. Several months passed, and the seasons quietly began to change across the mountains surrounding Aspen. Winter slowly surrendered to early spring, leaving patches of green beneath the melting snow while the familiar sounds of propellers, engines, and laughter once again filled the small airport each morning. Yet one thing remained exactly the same. Mason Reed still unlocked Hangar 12 before sunrise, still brewed the first pot of coffee, still inspected every aircraft as though someone he loved would be sitting inside it, and still smiled whenever Emma arrived after school, carrying another stack of library books beneath her arm. The world around him had changed far more than he had. Aviation magazines now discussed the new verification process inspired by his handheld safety device. Flight departments across the country quietly adopted similar procedures. Winslow Meridian Group became recognized not only for successful investments, but also for establishing one of the strongest independent aviation safety programs in private aviation. Whenever reporters asked Harper Winslow what had inspired those changes, she always gave the same answer. "One humble father reminded me that wisdom should never be measured by appearances." She never mentioned herself. She always spoke about him. One bright afternoon, Harper returned to Aspen for a community aviation scholarship ceremony. Students, mechanics, pilots, teachers, and families gathered inside the airport hangar where young people received awards encouraging careers built on responsibility rather than recognition. Harper invited Mason to stand beside her during the presentation, but he quietly shook his head. "The students should be the ones everyone remembers today." Harper smiled because she already knew that would be his answer. Instead, she invited Emma to present the first scholarship certificate. The little girl walked confidently onto the small stage, smiled at the audience, and read a single sentence her father had helped her write. "The safest hands are usually the kindest hands." For several long seconds, the room remained completely silent before warm applause gently filled the hangar. Many people wiped away quiet tears without embarrassment because they understood those simple words carried far more truth than any long speech ever could. After the ceremony ended, Harper, Mason, and Emma stood together outside as another aircraft climbed gracefully into the clear Colorado sky. Harper looked toward the mountains glowing beneath the evening sun. "You changed my company," she said softly. Mason smiled and slowly shook his head. "People only change when they choose to." Emma slipped her hand into her father's. "You always say airplanes teach people to look higher." Mason looked upward as the aircraft disappeared into the blue horizon. "They do," he answered gently. "But the most important lesson is remembering why we come back down." Harper understood exactly what he meant. Success meant very little if it never brought people safely home. She extended her hand one final time, and Mason accepted it with the same quiet humility that had defined him from the beginning. There were no cameras, no headlines, and no applause waiting for them. Only a peaceful runway stretching toward distant mountains and another ordinary evening that somehow felt extraordinary. As the golden light settled across Hangar 12, Mason picked up his familiar toolbox and walked back toward the next airplane waiting for inspection while Emma skipped happily beside him. Nothing about the old hangar looked different, yet everything inside it had quietly changed. The place where one overlooked single father had once been ignored became a reminder that dignity never needs to raise its voice. Kindness is never wasted, and the smallest act of respect can lift a human heart farther than even the most remarkable airplane can ever fly.